Hello and welcome to this webinar focusing on this year's edition of Education at a Glance, which was published today. Andreas Schleicher, Director of the OECD Directorate for Education and Skills, will present some of the key findings of the report and then answer your questions. Please feel free to send your questions to Eric Magnuson using the chat function at any time during the presentation. Andreas?
Thank you very much and welcome to the presentation on Education at a Glance, our 2016 edition. I want to start with something that many of us take for granted, but that actually is also shown in the numbers, namely that individuals now reap very high rewards for investing in better skills. Now, one way you can examine this is by summing up all the costs. Now, first of all, in some countries you pay high levels of tuition if you go to university. You also do not earn while you study, that's a cost as well. You tend to pay a lot more taxes when you're better educated, and you pay also social contributions. That's the cost side of it. But then you contrast this with the benefits in terms of earning more over your working life, being less likely to be unemployed, having sort of certain other types of transfer effects. And when you compare the left to the right side, you can see that basically individuals have very, very large net gains from obtaining a degree. Now what's interesting is that despite the rise in the number of highly qualified people throughout the world, actually their relative benefits are still rising, suggesting that in the knowledge economy, the demand for better educated workers is rising even faster than what we see in terms of supply. But it doesn't work out equally well for any form of tertiary qualifications. First of all, the blue bar shows you the penalty of not, getting at least a high school degree. The green bar shows you the benefit, financial benefit of going through any form of tertiary education. Some people, choose a short cycle course, a couple of years, tertiary education, they get some advantage out of it, but it varies a lot across countries. If you get a bachelor, that's pretty good, but actually the big advantage often comes in at the master's, doctoral, or equivalent level. You can see, for example, in some countries, it's almost 3 times the earnings of a high school graduate that you get at that level of education. That's at the individual level. At the very same time, it doesn't accrue to any form of subject. You can see, for example, if you study teacher training, education science, the earnings are typically a lot lower than if you go to science, mathematics, and computing. That's the yellow dot. Engineering, manufacturing, construction also turns out to be quite good. Health and welfare somewhere comes into the middle. So in a way, what you study has a huge influence as well on how you're going to come out in terms of lifetime earnings. Data we included for the first time to get beyond the average earnings. And this has many implications. For example, if we see that men and women choose different fields of study and different fields of study have different earnings outcomes, then you can see how gender differences actually play out into differences in incomes. And have a look at this. This shows you the share of female graduates in the sciences, the blue dot. And you can see it's pretty low in some countries, ranging from 40%, a bit more in Argentina, India, Poland, to less than 20% in Japan and Chile. You look at education, humanities, and social science, that's where you find many more women. But remember the previous chart I showed you, education, humanities, and social science isn't a particularly good choice if you want to earn a good salary. But that's where you see many women going. And so that has implications. On the cost side, the costs for men and women are obviously equal. But on the benefit side, you can see that men typically are at a major advantage over women. Men is the blue part here, the women the pink part. And the gap is quite substantial. It's not just field of study, of course. There are many other things, the incidence of part-time work and so on, but overall, you can see there's a big earnings gap and choice of studies. So that is certainly part of it. I talked a lot about money, getting a better salary, but that's not the whole story. We can see, for example, that the average percentage of adults that report about limitations due to health problems is rising for people with less than upper secondary schooling. people who have not completed high school. It's rising when you become older. Now you will say, well, that's what you would expect. When you get old, you have more health problems. But actually, you look at people who have completed high school and you find that that line is also upward sloping, but a lot lower overall. And for tertiary graduate, once again, overall the health levels, self-reported health levels tend to be better. Life satisfaction. Also there you can see that the life satisfaction that college graduates report tends to be much higher than those who have just completed high school or an equivalent vocational qualification. Now, that's for people. Going to study, studying longer, studying harder, pays off for you. But someone has got to pay for it. So we look at the balance sheet for taxpayers as well. But even there you can see, there are direct costs, there are indirect costs, but the benefits in terms of, governments getting more taxes from better qualified people, the benefits far outweigh the costs also for taxpayers. In one way you can say, taxpayers get about $100,000 more out of every graduate than what they invest on average. So it seems a good investment for individuals. It's a good investment, certainly also for taxpayers. So it's no surprise that more and more people are seeking better and better qualifications. And most countries have actually been able to raise spending, particularly on tertiary education, quite a bit. The pink bar here shows you the rise or fall in expenditure between 2008 and 2013. You can see in most countries the bars go up, in some quite a bit. Think about Turkey, raising spending by 70%. But you need to look at the participation as well. And you can see in most countries, participation rose almost as fast as sometimes faster than actually spending. Look at Denmark, a bit of more money, but a lot of more students. So the bottom line is that in some countries, spending per tertiary student has gone up. That's when you see the red dot above the line. But in a number of countries, now we have less money per student than we used to have. Denmark and Ireland are the most prominent examples here. So overall, students have fared quite well. More money has gone into everyone, but there are exceptions to this, where spending per student has declined. Now, how have countries mobilized additional resources? Well, government money is one source, but actually many countries have also found new and innovative ways to share the costs and benefits for education between the people who study, who earn a lot more later on, and society at large. So that means, charging them tuition. And when you look at this in primary, secondary education, that's not so big. But if you look at tertiary education, you can see a number of countries, Korea, Japan, United States, Chile, Australia, where more than half of the money is going into tertiary education. In other countries, the share is very low. In Finland, for example, Norway, most of tertiary education is paid through the public sector. Countries differ on this, but there has been a general trend, because demand is rising so rapidly, governments don't have so much more money. There has been a general trend to actually raise more money from the private sector. Some countries have done it in very intelligent ways. You look at New Zealand, United Kingdom, Australia, where basically governments give students loans and they ask them only to repay them once they have reached a certain income threshold. So it's a pretty safe investment for you as an individual. There's not much of a risk. If you don't earn, you don't pay. If you earn, you're going to pay back your costs. So there are formulas that have actually been able to raise money without introducing inequality. At the same time, you have countries here, Korea and Japan, a very good example, where people have to pay and the government still doesn't have really reliable loan system. Or in the United States, so many of the loans are more commercial. So you've got to pay up front, have to pay back irrespective of your future earnings. It's been a big trend. And here you can see the level of tuition fees for a number of countries, in public institutions, but also in private institutions. And you can see they vary a lot. Tuition in the United States is almost astronomically high. It's a class in itself. But in several other countries, particularly in private institutions, it's pretty it's a significant number as well. So the repayment formulas that countries have become very important. Now, all of that being said, more money needs to be paid by private people, but still, we see a rapidly rising demand for better education. This is the tertiary enrollment rate in 2014 at the bar, and then you can see the picture 10 years before that, 2005, in a red dot. You can see actually in most countries, the bar is longer than the dot. So actually you can see the growth in the share of tertiary qualified people has been quite significant in a number of countries. When you look into the future, one way to assess the future is by looking at who enters tertiary education. Here you can see the first-time tertiary entry rate, and you can see in some countries it's 90%. Now you ask yourself, how can New Zealand actually get 90% of this population into tertiary education? It is not possible because many actually don't have the necessary qualifications, and part of the answer lies in a lot of international students in countries like Switzerland, New Zealand, and so on. So you have to discount them, and that brings you to the red bar. That's basically the entry rate, or the share of people of an age cohort entering higher education, excluding international students. It's probably a fairer way to compare, but what you can see very clearly from here is in many countries, it's the majority of young people who are now getting a tertiary education. If I had shown you this chart 100 years ago, we would have seen something similar for school-level education. The question then was, what share of the young people will need to complete school to fulfill the needs of society? That's the question we can ask ourselves today for tertiary education. That's all great, more people getting better degrees, more money being available, but also we see that not every degree actually translates automatically in higher skills. One of the things that we did was to actually test the skills of people through an assessment of their literacy skills, their numeracy skills, their problem-solving skills, and then we looked at what's the distribution of skills by level of qualification. And in this chart, you see the percentage of adults who did really well on this test, scoring at level 4 or 5, is the highest level of this test, by level of education. You can see, in Japan, Finland, and the Netherlands, Sweden, Australia, those with a university qualification are doing really well. There's a high share of top-performing students. Now you can see in Spain, Greece, Lithuania, Italy, Chile, Turkey, that share is a lot lower. And in fact, you draw a line and you can see that in the Netherlands, Finland, or Japan, high school graduates come out as well as university graduates in other countries. So, whenever we look at degrees and qualifications, let's keep in mind the currency those hold in terms of the skills people actually have can vary a lot within countries, between countries. That's why not every degree, not every shining degree really is gold. Now, this was the story about the success in education. Those who are highly skilled, they have better and better life chances. But what we also see is that those who do not, make at least to a baseline qualification level, actually pay a rising price for it. You can see that in unemployment. The unemployment is so much higher in most countries for those who did not obtain a high school degree than it is for those who had a tertiary degree, or at least an upper secondary academic or vocational qualification. Huge employment gap. Employment, unemployment, all of this. It's also interesting that, gender differences in employment, who's actually in the workforce, vary a lot by the level of education. You can see that very clearly for those who do not have a high school degree, a lot more men are in employment than women. When you have a tertiary qualification among university graduates, employment is almost the same for men and women. So actually, the implications of skills on earnings, employment are very important, and there can be important gender differences. One group of people is always of great concern for us, and these are the young people who are neither in employment nor in education, who do not get the chance to upgrade their skills and who do not get a chance to use their skills. And if you look at the age group 20 to 24-year-olds, it's actually a very significant share. In some countries, it goes up to a quarter or more. Typically, women at a greater risk of being in this group than men, but overall, it's very significant. What we also see is that it hasn't really changed that much. Some countries have dropped, Turkey, Germany, very successful in reducing that risk group. But you look to Spain and Italy, it's actually been rising significantly. So it's an issue that our societies are confronting, that there are a large number of young people who simply fall through the cracks, and they're going to pay a higher and higher price year after year. We have also looked at mobility across generations for immigrants and non-immigrants. If your parents did not have a high school degree, the likelihood that you don't have a high school degree either is very significant in some countries. Italy and Spain, about 40%. But if your parents have a tertiary qualification, you're also much more likely to have a tertiary education yourself. In Singapore, it's pretty much close to 100%. What is very interesting that often immigrants come out differently on it. You see some countries in which sort of an immigrant background is moderated through society. Basically, you're not at a greater risk, but in other countries, you see the red dot sort of on both margins. The immigrant background gets amplified by educational opportunities. Immigrants being at a relatively higher risk to be a low performer or a higher risk to come out well on the distribution. So you can see really how inequalities play out so differently across countries. Let's look a little bit in more detail at the investments. Now we can see first of all that spending on education varies a lot across countries. When you basically add primary education and secondary education, you can see countries like Luxembourg, Switzerland. You can see during sort of the duration of primary and secondary studies, Luxembourg spends $250,000 per student. At the other end of the extreme, Mexico, Colombia, Indonesia, they can only dream of those numbers. It's a small fraction of it. It's a huge variation in the amount of money that countries spend on education. We also see that has changed. In the majority of countries, you can see the bars rising upward on this chart. That basically means there's more money now being spent on education than was the case in 2008. But this needs to be contrasted with student numbers. Here the pattern is sort of more mixed, because in most countries, basic education was already universal. So what you can see here are demographic fluctuations and other changes. Not so much going on. So in most countries, actually, increases in investment directly benefit the students. Nevertheless, a couple of countries on the right side of the chart where you can actually see students are worse off now than they were in 2008 in terms of the money being available for their education. One of the things that we've seen year after year is that those who need further education most often get the least of it. That's of course our dream, that education and training can moderate social disadvantages. Those who didn't get a good initial education may participate later on, but when you look at the data actually, you can see that participation in further education and training is much higher among those who are in skill-intensive jobs who use their skills very often than it is among adults with the lowest frequency of the use of skills in their daily life. So further education often tends to reinforce rather than moderate initial skill differences. Those who need the training most seem to get the least out of it. We also see that countries spend their money often quite differently. One way in which you can spend money is to pay your teachers well. But actually that's not often happening. This chart, I look at this in relative terms. If you are in the green side, teachers earn more than other tertiary educated workers. If you're on the red side, teachers are less well paid. And what you can see is in most countries, teachers are on the red side of the chart. So they earn less on average than somebody else with a similar qualification. Luxembourg and Greece are really the only exception on that pattern. So teacher pay varies, but it's generally not competitive. You can also look at the salary cost of teachers per student in public institutions. Also varies a lot by level of education. Typically, upper secondary education spend a bit more than on primary education, and so on. The teacher salary component has also undergone some patterns. You can see, for example, up to 2008, 9, 10, we spent more on teacher salaries. Then the financial crisis hit public budgets. You can see a quite steep decline on average, but actually salaries are now recovering. And that's a general trend which you can see across levels of education. We also see that salary scales, not just the average salary, but the way in which you earn money while you progress your career are very different across countries. Here you can see sort of how much more you can get from the basic salary when you start your profession, that's the blue dot here, up to the salary at the top of the scale. That's the triangle. And you can see in some countries that scale is very short. Your starting salary is more or less it. In other countries, Korea is a good example, Austria, you actually do have a steep progression. You can actually, every year that you are in service or where you get more qualifications, offers you more in terms of outcomes. So countries design their salary scales in quite different ways, as you can see from these data. The time that students spend in class also varies very significantly across countries. Look at Hungary, Latvia. You have just about 6,000 hours of instruction time in primary and lower secondary education. You compare that with Australia or Denmark, almost the double of it. So the number of hours that students spend in school is hugely different across countries. Same is true for class size. This picture shows you the classes for lower secondary education, and you can see basically classes are very large in China, close to 50, but also Japan and Korea, Chile, and so on. And they're very small in countries like Latvia and Estonia. Huge differences in the number of students per class. In primary education, classes tend to be a bit smaller. That's also quite natural. Smaller children need more attention, but you can see a similar pattern. A lot of variability. When you look at what has changed, and that was quite interesting for us, when we look between 2005 and 2014, a lot of investment has gone into making classes smaller. And it is interesting in the sense that it stands in contrast to what we see in many of the highest performing education systems. Whenever they have to make a choice between a better teacher and a smaller class, they have tended to invest, in the teacher salaries, in the teacher professional development, in the professionalization and work organization of teachers, and often kept classes quite large. But that is certainly, as you can see here, not been the most popular choice. In most countries, in fact, most money is got in making classes. So, more money, has it been a wise choice? Maybe not. Countries make also very different trade-offs between better pay and smaller classes. Have a look at this. When you look at the changes in teacher salary, that's the gray bar, that goes up. Basically, countries have sort of invested more between 2010 and 14 in raising salaries. Where it goes down, you can see declines in salaries in relative terms, class size as well, and then, both things impact on student costs. If you do like Hungary, you basically raise the teacher salary, and you also sort of change the class size. It adds up quite a bit. Or Israel. Israel has made classes smaller. That's been very expensive. And even if teacher salaries didn't change that much, the cost per student has really risen a lot. Portugal is another example. Portugal had to cut teacher salaries at the other end of the spectrum. It had to cut teacher salaries because of the financial crisis, but it didn't the major cut was by making classes larger, so teachers didn't have to suffer that much, and still Portugal could save quite a lot of money. How many hours teachers work and teach is also differing hugely across countries. Now, this is the number of teaching hours per year by level of education. Now, you can see in Colombia and Chile, teachers have long work days, teaching days, Scotland as well. At the same time, in Denmark and Greece, the Russian Federation teaching hours are much more limited. Again, this is one of the items people have to consider. How much time should teachers spend in the classroom as opposed to spending time on other important work responsibilities? Instruction leadership. Now, we always look at school principals. They play such a pivotal role in building a climate, collaboration, of professional development, leadership in schools, and you can actually see that this varies a lot as well. For example, when you think about how much time or what's the share of principals who actually observe instruction in the classroom, you can see in Shanghai, in China, very, very high. Basically, all principals devote time to look at what happens in the classroom. In countries like France, Estonia, and Portugal, that's a very rare exception. We talked about less than 1 in 10 principals who say this. Taking action to support cooperation among teachers to develop new ideas, new pedagogies, new teaching practices. There is a lot of questions. Taking action to ensure that teachers take responsibility for investing in their own skills. Very, very high in some countries, not so common in others. So principals, the role of principals seems to be quite different depending on where you go to school. A few words on early learning. What we basically see is that whether children go to early childhood education and care or not, it's something that we can see in their skills when they reach the age of 15 and take part in the PISA. Basically what we did is in the PISA test we asked the students, did you participate in early childhood education and care, and for how long? You can see those who had no pre-primary education are at a much greater risk to be poor performers on PISA, not reaching the baseline level, whereas those who took part for more than a year in pre-primary education, they are at a much lower risk to be poor performers at age 15. Now, the causal nature of this is very hard to discern from this. There could be a selection effect. But those people who do not go into early childhood education are a particularly group. We cannot establish this from here, but it is something that the relationship in itself is quite interesting. And this has also been one of the areas where we have seen a lot of progress. If I had shown you a chart 10 years ago of enrollment of 3-year-olds, it used to be very, very patchy. But now you have a fair number of countries where it's quite normal for 3-year-olds to be in early childhood education here. But there are also countries where this is not well established. You look at, Greece, Costa Rica, Switzerland, Turkey, Brazil, Australia, Mexico, the United States, where actually you just talk about a small minority of children. How much do countries invest? Huge differences as well. You look at Norway, Sweden, almost 2% of GDP going into early learning, early education. You look at Ireland, you look at Switzerland, Japan, it's sort of a very, very small percentage, or fraction of a percent, who actually benefit, is invested in early learning. One reason for this are big differences in the ratio of pupil to teaching staff in early learning. I didn't count all of the staff working in early childhood education in theory, but the people who have pedagogical qualification, you can see really that differs a lot. If you're in Sweden or Australia, you're really lucky. You get a lot of, you have only 5 children per teacher. If you're in Chile and Mexico, it's 25. Huge differences in the way resources are being spent. Last point I want to make is a bit about internationalization. When you look at the foreign enrollment, you can see the United States attracts lots of international students, basically because it's a big country. In the relative terms, it's actually quite small, but the UK is a different case. It's a much smaller country, but a much bigger relative share. France, Germany, and then Australia. It's a tiny country compared to the United States, but has almost a third of the international students as the United States. It's a very attractive place for people to study. And we have seen those things changing. Here you can see in Russia, in Latvia, Poland, actually more people going there to study. In Spain and Turkey, we're seeing people sort of less for now. Student mobility in relative terms. Here you can see in Luxembourg, lots of international students, particularly at master's level. New Zealand, Australia, UK, Switzerland, Austria. These are the countries that are very, very successful in attracting international students. And then it goes down the list up to Spain, Poland, and Chile for the international students. A lot of variation, and a lot of variation in the relative market share of students as well. And I think I'll leave it here so that we have sufficient time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andreas. We do have some questions from our listeners. One of the first is, the majority of teachers in the field of secondary education in Greece are female. However, in leadership positions, females are in the minority. In what ways could this be overcome?
Well, that's actually a phenomenon that we observe in most countries. You know, if you look at pre-primary education, primary education, you find a much larger share of female teachers than when you look at secondary education and, as you say, tertiary education. One reason for this is that often, you know, early learning and primary education, there are jobs that are more easily to reconcile with family responsibilities. You know, you work in the morning, you can be at home in the afternoon. One way to address this is to redesign those occupations, both in terms of the work organization that has happened in some countries. The Nordic countries are a good example, but also in terms of the pay structure. Let's be honest, in many countries, if you are in early childhood education and care, you do not get great pay. And that is usually something that, you know, pushes certain groups into those occupations. So having a kind of pay structure and an occupational structure and a distribution of time that is more attractive to both genders could change it. And the fact that it is possible to change is quite visible in the differences in the share of females at different levels of education.
And in fact, we have a related question. Is there any evidence that higher teacher salaries attract the more capable or more gifted candidates to the profession?
It's a good question. You know, you can consider a good teacher salary, a competitive teacher salary, as a necessary condition to attract teachers, but it is certainly not sufficient. We have actually good evidence that suggests that, you know, having attractive career prospects, having a collaborative work organization, those issues have a greater influence even on teacher job satisfaction than simply the salaries. So yeah, in some countries, salaries are being used to attract people. Now that's typically the case in East Asia. The salaries in relative terms are very, very good there, and they pay for this with larger class sizes. But there are a lot of other things going on as well. Finland would be a good example. It's the country that has made teaching the second most attractive occupation among all classes of occupations. You know, imagine this: young people don't want to become lawyers or economists; they want to become teachers. And still, salaries are only so-so. They're not bad, but they're not that strong. And what you have in Finland is just a very, very attractive work organization and environment that sort of people like to work at.
Someone asked a question concerning NEETs. This person suggested that Spain is one of the OECD countries that has not really reduced the rate of NEETs to levels prior to the financial crisis. What do you think could be done to reduce this rate?
Well, actually, to be fair, to be honest, Spain is doing worse now than it did at the beginning of the financial crisis. I mean, it's one of the countries where the share of people who are neither in employment nor in education has actually grown. But even historically, Spain always had a high share of young people who went into nowhere. And these people are at the greatest risk. You could see that their employment prospects are poor, their earnings prospects are poor, and also because skills that you do not use, you actually lose. So we can have clear evidence that the skills of people who are neither in education, who cannot upgrade their skills, nor have any chance to use their skills, they actually end up worse than where they started. So what can you do about it? There are many things that sort of, Portugal, you know, neighboring country is an example that actually has worked harder on this, giving people actually, first of all, you know, active job search policies, you know, making it, you know, putting some of the responsibility for actually looking hard for a job on the people, investing in them to build foundational skills they didn't get at school. There are many things that countries can do, but it's hard. You know, the one lesson you can take away from all of this: almost anything that happens to you after you graduate from school tends to reinforce initial skill differences, not moderate them. So where we don't get the foundations right, and there's a large share of young people in Spain falling through the cracks in the school system, it's very, very hard to correct later on. But at the same time, we look at the share at the countries which have been successful in reducing the needs. It's not impossible.
We have a couple of questions related to tertiary education. One is, what would you consider to be some of the key characteristics of the most effective tertiary education systems? And related to that, what, in your opinion, makes a country attractive to international students? This questioner said that China, for example, is making itself more of an attractive destination for these kinds of students. Do you see this as a potential for China, and if so, why?
Yeah, these are quite different questions. On the first part, you know, one aspect that is always important is, you know, what bridges are there between the world of education and the world of work. High-quality tertiary education systems provide people with many options. You know, they serve an increasingly diverse client base with an increasingly diverse pathways. That means a combination of short, middle, and long degrees rather than pushing people through sort of long pipelines, giving people many choices of where they study, how they learn, when they learn. I think that these are very important attributes of successful tertiary education systems. Having sustainable financing, and that means, you know, finding a good balance between, you know, who pays and who benefits, making sure that the people who earn better salaries later on contribute that part, making sure that taxpayers ensure that nobody who is qualified doesn't get a chance, so income contingent loan systems. All of those are attributes of a successful tertiary education system. Having a labor market that recognizes degrees and qualifications and translates better skills into better jobs and better lives. You know, the United States is a great example, is a very important aspect out of this. So that's what makes a tertiary education system successful. What makes a system attractive to international students, you know, a big part of this is reputation. One has to be quite clear on that. You know, it's very hard for new countries to enter that market. Countries that have sort of historic advantage, that have linguistic advantage, you know, when you go to a country to study, you need to speak that language. And where countries offer courses in English, they do have an advantage. So that's what actually many countries are now trying to go towards the students, recognizing prior learning, offering superior labor market outcomes. And you look at the data, you know, Switzerland, England, Australia, New Zealand, they are doing really, really well on it. Country like the United States does well, but only because it's a large country. In relative terms, it ranks, you know, in the 20s. So it's not. But I think countries that have, you know, geared themselves towards an international student market, that are open to this, that provide, that recognize the learning people have gone through before, they tend to be very, very successful. Australia makes a lot of money with this. You know, they don't see that as a liability. They have found cost structures that make sure that those people pay their costs, and actually the government benefits from that, and institutions even more.
Thank you. We also have a couple of questions about early childhood education and care. Do we have any data on the level of education of the teachers who teach the youngest children? And a related question, should expenditure on education focus more on early childhood education? And if so, is there evidence for what you would consider to be one of the more effective systems?
Yeah, you know, historically we tend to spend more money on people who are older. But actually, when you look at effectiveness, the money that you invest early is the money that is spent most effectively. The early learning part is the one where you can, you know, foster talents, but also counter disadvantage most effectively. And staff qualifications are the key. You know, no education system can be better than its teachers. And that's actually the part that we have long underestimated in early learning. When you get to school, you know, you become a teacher. There's a complicated bureaucratic process. You have to get a certain qualification, accreditation, all of that. We don't do almost any of that for early childhood education. It isn't very hard in most countries to get into this. You're not particularly well paid. Now, you've seen the differences on the cost. There's a lot to do for countries to assure quality, to make this a more regulated quality provision. And part of the reason is that we historically regard early childhood education as sort of a care. And people think that anybody can take care of children. The more the education part becomes prominent and parents are looking for that increasingly, the more we need to think much harder about how do we provide an environment which attracts highly qualified people, but also invests in their skills and rewards those skills. This is something you can see these figures here very clearly. The spending that we afford for children is so much lower than it is for people who go to university. And there's no clear reason for that, other than history.
We have a question, two questions, one related to student learning time and one related to teacher teaching time. In countries like Finland, where total teaching instruction time is much lower than in other countries, what kinds of non-instruction activities are teachers doing? And the flip side of this is we see in the slides the great variety of learning time, for students. Is there a threshold for students when actually more time in class becomes too much time in class?
It's a very interesting question. When you look at this within countries, you can see almost, automatically, the more time you add, the better students are. So within countries, there is a clear relationship, and there is no end to this. So basically, adding more time always gets you better outcomes. When you look at this across countries, you can see no relationship whatsoever. And what this tells us is that, holding quality constant, more time will add you more. But actually, the quality of learning is a much more powerful determinant of learning outcomes than simply the quantity. But Finland is a very good example. Students go to school at age 7. They have one of the shortest school days, but the quality of instruction is very high. Would Finland add more hours? They would get a better outcome. I don't think I wouldn't have any doubt on this because that's what the data show. But what Finland has achieved is a combination of time use that seems to be very, very effective to optimize learning outcomes. And it's a very deliberate choice. Basically, they do not want their teachers just to stand in the classroom and give one lesson after the other. They want their teachers to have the time to observe other teachers' classrooms. They want to give teachers the time to have access to professional development. And that's actually a feature that we see in many of the highest performing education systems. You take, my country, Germany, 740 hours is what you have to teach as a secondary teacher. If you're in Japan, it's 500 hours. And the Japanese do work harder than the Germans, but they actually invest a much greater share of their time in working with parents, working individually with students, taking part in collaborative professional development. And those teams actually have a very significant impact, both in shaping teacher-student relationships, but also in raising the quality of education. So how we use the time of teachers is a very, very important factor. If you look at the United States, most of the money that has been spent in the last years has gone into making classes smaller. But because the government wasn't able to raise more money, they have actually simply, made it ask teachers to teach more of their time. And it's not necessarily a wise choice. They've cut teacher salaries, they have, given teachers less opportunities to other types of teaching, and just to afford smaller classes, they have compromised the quality of teaching. And whenever high-performing education systems have to make a choice between a better teacher and a smaller class, they always go for the better teacher.
Thank you. We have another interesting question here. Many statistics highlight the message about how important education is both for personal salary and for national average income growth. But isn't Japan an exception to this? Japan seems to score very high in many tests, but still has a sluggish economy. What could account for this?
Yeah, that's another really good question. There are two things that you need. You need to have talent, and you need to use that talent effectively. You take the case of Japan. They come out number 1 in our assessment of adult skills. They have the most advanced talent pool in the population. But when you look actually how well the economy uses the skills, it comes out almost at the bottom. Because, women are excluded from many occupations, the labor market is very silent, you can't change your job, even if and there are sort of many rigidities in the job market that prevent people to actually make good use out of the skill. You contrast this with the United States. You have actually a very patchy talent pool. Most people overestimate the qualification levels and the skill levels of Americans. But no economy is better than the American one in extracting value from the skills of people, turning better skills into better jobs and better lives. And that's why people from all over the world go to the United States to earn a good salary. So you need both things. You need to invest in the skills of people, that's the talent base, but you need to have really good policies and practices that give people a chance to use their skills effectively. And Japan is just a very good example of a country that hasn't got that right.
On an entirely different dimension to education, we have a couple of questions concerning well-being. Do we have any data about the socio-emotional skills that should be taught in schools that relate to better outcomes for students? And do we have any data measuring the well-being of teachers as well as school students?
Yeah, on the student front, we're making good progress. Actually, the 2015 PISA assessment has a big component on student well-being into this. We're going to report that in June 2017. It's going to be a really interesting data set because it also shows that, well-being and cognitive outcomes can actually go quite well together, but you can also achieve neither. It isn't like this, reduce the pressure on students, teach them less, and they will be happier. So this is something that I think is going to be really interesting. We are able to measure an increasing range of social and emotional qualities at the student level. Teacher well-being is something that we are discussing for our next round of the Teaching and Learning International Survey, TALIS, but it's just much, much harder to actually measure. What we do now is to what extent teachers are happy with their job. Those kinds of data exist, but sort of the broader dimension of teacher well-being isn't yet well researched.
Thank you. Another couple of questions concerning tertiary education. Given the fact that graduates move from country to country due to immigration, globalization, how significant would you see intercultural competence, both in tertiary education, but also in the wider world? And in addition to this, or linked to this, how important is it to have greater emphasis on establishing international standards for competencies rather than certifications?
I would consider higher education as a very, very important place to develop global competencies. The capacity of people to see the world through different lenses, different perspectives, to understand, appreciate different ideas, different cultures. I think tertiary education, or education in general, can make a huge contribution to this. But to be realistic, that affects currently only a very small share of students who can afford it. I think we can do a lot better, and I think new technologies will help us to actually significantly expand the reach of education beyond borders, so that students anywhere in the world can actually get a much better impression of different cultures, different ideas, different ways of thinking, which in a global economy is increasingly important. I mean, the issue around fragmentation that we have in our societies, that is something that I think we all face. So, this is something that has been probably more of a byproduct of education in the past, and the more we can put that in focus, make this a deliberate outcomes, teach global citizenship, develop global competences in school, the willingness of people to look upwards, I think the more we will help the next generation to live and succeed in this world.
Another question asks, do we have any information on teacher dropout rates and measures of education outcomes?
Absolutely. Actually, this is something that is quite well covered in this year's edition of Education at a Glance. Teacher tenure, it varies a lot. And there are push and pull factors. For some teachers, there are very few career opportunities. Salary prospects are not good, so they leave the profession. In other cases, the teacher job market is just not much more open. Having very, very long tenure is not necessarily a good sign. You take countries like Italy and Germany, where the vast majority of teachers is now over the age of 50. So it's a lifetime job. Why? Because it's a golden cage. It's very, very difficult to it's a closed public sector profession. So I don't think we should look at teacher dropout only as a negative phenomenon. We should look at it increasingly like in any kind of labor market, giving people the opportunities to move inward and outward, creating maybe also more alternative pathways into teaching. All of those things are ones that we should be looking at much more carefully. So yes, we know about teacher dropout, but unlike student dropout, which is always problematic because if you don't get the degree and qualification, it's very, very hard to make turn your studies into value. But for teachers, I think we should look at this in a much more open and flexible way than we have done in the past.
And we have a couple of more questions concerning early childhood education. Is there any evidence indicating a relationship between the amount of public investment and the enrollment rate in early childhood education? That's the first. And in another more specific question, the questioner says that Sweden is doing well in enrollment for pre-education, but there is a problem with students' lack of interest in mathematics in secondary and primary school. How do we square this circle? How do we justify this difference?
Yeah, on the first question, actually the relationship is not automatic. You take a country like Norway or Sweden that invests a lot and that has really good enrollment, You take a country like the United States, you know, it's less than 40% of 3-year-olds that get some attention in care, but those who actually make it get a lot of money. So actually, that in other countries, you know, have very high enrollment rates. You know, Germany has now a very high enrollment rate in kindergarten, but actually spends very little money on each child. So those things don't necessarily go together, and I think it's a difficult choice that countries need to make between quantity and quality. The question of interest and engagement in science is one that we've spent a lot of time researching. It's a difficult one, and indeed the often declining levels of interest in math and science are a deep concern because they shape the student's future pathways. You know, if you do not see science as something that opens life opportunities, then you're not going to go to study science, to go into science occupation. So this is something that education systems have to work harder on. Sometimes even students who do well on a science test are still not interested, still not engaged. So just good performance doesn't give you that engagement. But, you know, if you would run a supermarket, you know, rather than, you know, a school, and you would see that from 100 customers every day, 30 walk out without buying anything, and that happens to you on Monday, on Tuesday, the next week, the next year, the next decade. You change your inventory, you know. You would start to think to make things differently, and we haven't seen that in school, and probably today young people want to see a different level of science. You know, the world around them has changed. The questions that science needs to answer have changed, and we often haven't really mirrored that well in the instructional environment. So it's not just the problem, it's not just with the students. It's probably also with the way in which we teach and learn science.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I think that's about all we have time for today. I want to thank you all for your interest in this year's Education at a Glance and in the OECD's work on education and skills in general. Next year's Education at a Glance, in fact, will include information on the impact of immigration on education. I think you might already know that this webinar has been recorded and will be available in a couple of days on our website, www.oecd.org/edu. Thank you all again for joining us, and hope to see you or hear you next time.